At 10 o'clock on the morning of June 19, 1944, Lieutenant Commander Charles Brewer sat in the cockpit of his F6F Hellcat aboard the USS Essex, watching the radar plot in the Combat Information Center below paint a picture that defied comprehension. 69 Japanese aircraft were heading directly toward Task Force 58. Then 109 more appeared behind them, then another wave, then another. By noon, over 400 Japanese aircraft would fill the Philippine sea sky in the largest carrier air battle in history. Brewer was 28 years old. He had survived Midway. He had flown Wildcats when the Zero still owned the Pacific. He had buried friends at Wake Island and watched squadrons disappear over Guadalcanal. Now he commanded Fighter Squadron 15, and the Japanese were throwing everything they had at the American fleet. The mathematics were simple. 15 American carriers, nearly 900 aircraft, against 9 Japanese carriers, approximately 450 aircraft. But mathematics told only part of the story. The real equation was written in training hours, in factory production lines, in the fundamental shift that had occurred since Pearl Harbor. The Japanese pilots climbing into their cockpits that morning believed they could still win. Their commanders had promised them victory. Their emperor had blessed the mission. Their aircraft carried the same rising sun insignia that had terrorized Pearl Harbor, that had swept through the Philippines, that had humiliated the British at Singapore. They had no idea what was waiting for them. What happened over the next 12 hours would not simply be a battle. It would be an execution, a systematic destruction so complete that American pilots would give it a name that has echoed through history ever since. They called it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. And when the sky finally cleared, Japan's naval aviation would exist only as a memory. The path to June 19, 1944 began in fire. December 7, 1941, Pearl Harbor. Japanese aircraft screamed across the Hawaiian sky and the world changed. The Mitsubishi A6M0 was unlike anything American pilots had ever faced. It could climb 3,000 feet per minute. It could turn inside any fighter the United States possessed. It weighed barely 5,300 pounds, light as a racing yacht, and just as nimble. At Pearl Harbor, the Zero encountered no resistance. At Wake Island, it swept Marine Wildcats from the sky. Over the Philippines, it destroyed American air power in hours. Pilots who survived those early encounters described the Zero in terms that bordered on mystical. It turned on a dime. It climbed like an elevator. It seemed to break every rule of aerodynamics. The reality was simpler and more brutal. Japanese designers had built the Zero around a single philosophy: sacrifice everything for performance. The aircraft had no armor plating, no self-sealing fuel tanks. The pilot sat in an aluminum shell surrounded by aviation gasoline with nothing between him and enemy bullets except thin metal skin. One burst of gunfire could transform a Zero into a fireball. But in 1941 and 1942, that vulnerability rarely mattered. American pilots couldn't hit what they couldn't catch. The Grumman F4F Wildcat, the Navy's frontline fighter, was slower, less maneuverable, and outclassed in almost every measurable way. Wildcat pilots who engaged Zeros in turning fights died. The few who survived learned to run, to dive, to avoid combat whenever possible. The kill ratio told the story. In the first 6 months of the Pacific War, Japanese naval aviators shot down American aircraft at rates approaching 10-1. The Zero wasn't just a fighter, it was a psychological weapon. American pilots feared it in ways that affected their judgment, their tactics, their willingness to engage. Lieutenant Commander John Thatch, commanding Fighting Squadron 3, understood the problem better than most. Thatch had flown against Zeros at Midway. He had watched squadron mates die in seconds, and he had developed something that would help change the war: the Thatch weave. A defensive maneuver where two Wildcats flew in a weaving pattern, each covering the other's tail. When a Zero attacked one aircraft, the other would turn into it, forcing the Japanese pilot to break off or face head-on fire. The thatch weave worked. It reduced losses. But it was a defensive tactic designed to survive rather than dominate. What the Navy needed was a new aircraft, a fighter that could meet the Zero on equal terms and win. That aircraft was already being built. The Grumman F6F Hellcat first flew on June 26, 1942, 6 months after Pearl Harbor. The timing was not coincidental. Grumman engineers had received captured Zero components from the Aleutian Islands, where a Japanese pilot had crash-landed on Akutan Island with his aircraft largely intact. For the first time, Americans could study their enemy's greatest weapon up close. What they found confirmed what combat reports had suggested. The Zero was brilliantly designed for offense and catastrophically vulnerable in defense. No armor, no protection for the fuel tanks, lightweight construction that couldn't absorb damage. The Zero won fights by killing enemies before they could shoot back. If an American aircraft could survive long enough to return fire, the Zero would burn. The Hellcat was designed around that single insight. It would not be nimble. It would not dance with Zeros. It would be a brawler, built to absorb punishment and deliver destruction. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp engine produced 2,000 horsepower, nearly twice the power of the Zero's Nakajima Sakai. The Hellcat's top speed reached 380 miles per hour, faster than the Zero at all altitudes. More importantly, the Hellcat could dive at speeds that would tear a Zero apart. In a vertical plunge, the American fighter could reach 450 miles per hour and maintain control while the Zero's lightweight structure would fail. The armament was overwhelming. 650 caliber Browning M2 machine guns, each firing 750 rounds per minute. Total ammunition capacity exceeded 2,400 rounds. A 2-second burst put 150 half-inch projectiles into a target area the size of a dining table. Against the Zero's unprotected fuel tanks, that burst was fatal. But the Hellcat's most important feature was one that never appeared in performance specifications. It was survivable. 212 pounds of cockpit armor protected the pilot. Self-sealing fuel tanks could absorb multiple hits without igniting. The rugged construction allowed Hellcats to return to carriers with damage that would have destroyed 3 Zeros. The first Hellcats reached combat squadrons in January 1943. By September, they were the Navy's primary carrier fighter, and the kill ratios began to change. At Marcus Island in August 1943, Hellcats achieved their first major victory. At Tarawa in November, they swept Japanese aircraft from the sky. At Truk in February 1944, the legendary Japanese base that Americans called the Gibraltar of the Pacific, Hellcats destroyed over 200 aircraft in 2 days. But numbers only partially explain what happened. The real transformation was human. Japanese naval aviation in 1941 possessed perhaps the finest carrier pilots in the world. Men who had trained for years, who had flown hundreds of hours, who had honed their skills in combat over China. These were elite warriors, and their expertise was irreplaceable. By 1944, most of them were dead. Midway had killed over 100 experienced pilots in a single day. The Solomons campaign had ground down hundreds more. Rabaul had consumed another generation. Each battle took men who had taken years to train, and Japan could not replace them fast enough. Flight schools that once graduated pilots with 500 hours of training were now pushing men into cockpits with 100 hours or less. Some arrived at their squadrons barely able to land on a carrier deck. Meanwhile, American pilot training expanded exponentially. By 1944, the United States was graduating 30,000 pilots annually. Each carrier pilot received a minimum of 300 hours of flight training before reaching the fleet. They practiced gunnery until deflection shooting became instinct. They flew navigation exercises until instrument flying was second nature. They trained in aircraft carriers until deck landings were routine rather than terrifying. The industrial disparity was equally stark. In 1944, American factories produced 96,318 aircraft. Japan produced 28,180. For every plane Japan built, America built 3. For every pilot Japan trained, America trained 4. Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa understood these numbers when he planned the defense of the Marianas. He knew his pilots were inferior. He knew his aircraft were obsolete. He knew the odds were against him. But he also knew that losing the Marianas would give American B-29 bombers the range to strike Japan itself. The islands had to be held, whatever the cost. Ozawa's plan was desperate and ingenious. Japanese carrier aircraft had longer range than their American counterparts, approximately 350 miles compared to 200. Ozawa intended to exploit this advantage by launching his strikes from beyond American reach. His aircraft would hit Task Force 58, then land on airfields in Guam and Rota to refuel and rearm. They would shuttle back and forth, multiplying their effectiveness, while American aircraft couldn't strike back. The plan assumed 2 things. First, that Japanese pilots could navigate the long distances accurately. Second, that the American fighters couldn't reach Japanese carriers. Both assumptions were wrong. Admiral Mark Mitcher commanded Task Force 58. 15 carriers organized into 4 task groups, spread across 35 miles of ocean, 7 fleet carriers, 8 light carriers, 891 aircraft, including 475 Hellcats. It was the most powerful naval aviation force ever assembled. Mitcher was 57 years old. He had commanded the Hornet when Doolittle's raiders launched their attack on Tokyo. He had led carrier groups at Midway and in the Solomons. He understood carrier warfare better than perhaps any officer alive, and he understood what was coming. On June 18, 1944, American submarines spotted Ozawa's fleet steaming toward the Marianas. Task Force 58 prepared for battle. Mitcher's orders were simple: protect the invasion fleet at Saipan, destroy Japanese air power, win the battle for the Pacific. That night, aboard carriers across the task force, pilots received their briefings. They studied recognition silhouettes of Japanese aircraft. They reviewed tactics. They checked and rechecked their Hellcats. Sleep came hard, if at all. Lieutenant Alexander Vrasiu was a pilot with Fighting Squadron 16 aboard the USS Lexington. He had already shot down 12 Japanese aircraft, making him one of the Navy's leading aces. On the night of June 18th, he wrote a letter to his parents. He didn't mention the coming battle. He wrote about the weather, about food, about missing home. The letter might be his last. He knew it. His parents would know it. Some things didn't need to be said. Dawn on June 19th came slowly. The sky lightened from black to gray to pale blue. The Philippine Sea stretched flat and calm, deceptively peaceful. Aboard the Japanese carriers, aircraft were being spotted for launch. Aboard the American carriers, pilots manned their ready rooms, waiting. At 5:50, Japanese scout planes began lifting off from Ozawa's carriers. Their mission was simple: find the American fleet, report its position, guide the strike aircraft to their targets. At 08:30, they found it. The first radar contact appeared on American screens at 0957. The Combat Information Center aboard the USS Lexington tracked a formation of aircraft 140 miles to the west, heading directly for Task Force 58. Minutes later, a second formation appeared, then a third. Admiral Mitcher gave the order: launch fighters. Across the task force, carrier decks erupted in controlled chaos. Hellcats roared down catapults and rumbled off flight decks. Within minutes, 450 American fighters were climbing toward the incoming enemy. The largest aerial battle of the Pacific War had begun. The first Japanese wave consisted of 69 aircraft: Zeros, Judys, Jills. They flew in tight formation, discipline maintained, heading for the American carriers with single-minded determination. Their leader was Commander Akira Tarui, a veteran pilot who had survived 3 years of Pacific combat. He expected opposition. He expected losses. He expected to reach the American fleet. He did not expect what happened next. The Hellcats hit the Japanese formation at 25,000 feet, diving from altitude with the sun behind them. The first zero exploded without warning, then another, then 3 more. The American fighters slashed through the formation like razors, firing 2-second bursts, climbing away before the Japanese could react. Commander Tarui's radio filled with screaming. Aircraft were falling everywhere. Fires bloomed across the sky. His formation shattered in seconds, pilots scattering in panic and confusion. Lieutenant Commander Charles Brewer led the first intercept. His division of 4 Hellcats dove on the Japanese formation from 28,000 feet. Brewer locked onto a zero at 800 yards, fired, watched it explode. He pulled up, found another target, fired again. Another kill. In 90 seconds, Brewer's division destroyed 8 aircraft. The Japanese tried to fight back. Some Zeros turned into the attacking Hellcats, attempting the turning fights that had worked so well in 1942. They died. The Hellcat pilots refused to engage in horizontal combat. They dove, fired, climbed, repeated. Every attack came from above. Every escape route pointed upward. The Zeros couldn't follow. Lieutenant Alexander Vrasiu found himself in the middle of the carnage. In 8 minutes, he shot down 6 aircraft. His gun camera footage, recovered and preserved, shows the precision of the slaughter. One Judy bomber filling his gun sight, a brief burst, flames erupting from the engine, the aircraft rolling inverted and falling toward the sea. Then another target, and another. Vrasiu landed aboard the Lexington with his ammunition nearly exhausted. He held up 6 fingers for the photographers. The image became one of the war's most famous photographs. By 10:30, the first Japanese wave had ceased to exist. Of 69 aircraft launched, perhaps 24 survived to return to their carriers. Only 1 bomb hit an American ship, causing minor damage to the battleship South Dakota. No aircraft penetrated the fighter screen. But Ozawa didn't know. His radio communications were poor. Reports from the first wave were confused, fragmented. Some pilots claimed hits on American carriers. Others reported success. Ozawa believed his attack had damaged the American fleet. He ordered the second wave to launch. The second wave was larger, 109 aircraft, Zeros, Judys, Jills, even some obsolete Kate torpedo bombers dragged out of reserve. They climbed from Ozawa's carriers at 0856, formed up, and headed east. The American radar tracked them from 115 miles out. Fighter directors had 45 minutes to position intercepts. By the time the second wave approached Task Force 58, over 200 Hellcats were waiting. The slaughter exceeded the first wave. Lieutenant Commander William Dean led 12 Hellcats into the Japanese formation at 1100. In the first pass, his squadron destroyed 15 aircraft. Dean himself shot down 3 Judys and 2 Zeros before his guns ran empty. He returned to his carrier, rearmed in 17 minutes, launched again, and shot down 2 more. The Japanese formation disintegrated. Aircraft scattered in all directions. Some tried to press through to the American carriers. They died. Some turned back toward their own fleet. Many of them died too, shot down during the long retreat. Some simply became lost, their inexperienced pilots unable to navigate the featureless ocean. Lieutenant Junior Grade Wilbur Webb found himself alone against 12 Japanese aircraft. His division had become separated during the initial intercept. Webb should have retreated, should have waited for support. Instead, he attacked. Webb dove on the lead Zero from above and behind. 1 burst, 1 kill. He pulled up, rolled, found another target. The Japanese pilots were confused, disorganized. They couldn't coordinate their defense. Webb shot down 2 more aircraft before his wingman rejoined him. Together they destroyed 4 more. When Webb landed, his crew chief counted 200 bullet holes in his Hellcat. The armor plate behind his seat had stopped 7 rounds. The self-sealing fuel tanks had absorbed 3 more. Webb was uninjured. Of the 109 aircraft in the second wave, fewer than 30 returned to Japanese carriers. Almost none reached the American fleet. The third wave launched at 1,000. 47 aircraft. By now even Ozawa was beginning to understand something had gone terribly wrong. Reports from survivors of the first 2 waves painted a picture of catastrophe. But the battle plan called for continued attacks. The Marianas had to be defended. There was no choice but to continue. The third wave approached Task Force 58 from the north, attempting to avoid the main fighter concentration. American radar detected them anyway. Fighter directors vectored 40 Hellcats to intercept. The battle lasted 7 minutes. When it ended, the third wave had lost half its aircraft without reaching the American carriers. But the Japanese disaster was not limited to the air. While Ozawa's aircraft were being systematically destroyed, American submarines were stalking his carriers. The USS Albacore, commanded by Commander James Blanchard, had been trailing the Japanese fleet since dawn. At 09:10, Blanchard maneuvered into attack position on the carrier Taiho, the newest and largest carrier in the Japanese fleet. Ozawa's flagship. Blanchard fired 6 torpedoes at 1,300 yards, 1 hit. The damage initially seemed minor. Taiho continued operations. Aircraft continued launching, but the torpedo had ruptured aviation fuel storage tanks. Gasoline vapors began spreading through the ship. At 14:32, 6 hours after the torpedo hit, a spark ignited the accumulated fumes. The explosion tore Taiho apart. The flight deck buckled. Fires swept through the hangar deck. Within minutes, the carrier was a floating inferno. 1,650 men died, including most of the ship's air group. Ozawa transferred his flag to a destroyer, watching his flagship sink beneath the waves. 2 hours later, another American submarine struck. The USS Kavala, commanded by Commander Herman Kostler, found the carrier Shokaku recovering aircraft from the morning strikes. Shokaku was a veteran ship. She had attacked Pearl Harbor. She had fought at Coral Sea, at Santa Cruz, in a dozen other battles. Her luck ran out in the Philippine Sea. Kostler fired 6 torpedoes. 3 hit. Shokaku staggered, took on water, began listing. Fires broke out. The damage control teams fought desperately, but the flooding was uncontrollable. At 15:01, Shokaku rolled over and sank, taking 1,272 men with her. The fourth Japanese wave was the smallest and most pathetic. 49 aircraft, many of them trainers and obsolete types, pressed into service. They launched at 1100, headed for Task Force 58, and encountered the same wall of Hellcats that had destroyed the first 3 waves. The fourth wave didn't even come close. American fighters intercepted them 75 miles from the fleet. In the running battle that followed, 39 of the 49 aircraft were destroyed. Some survivors attempted to land on Guam, only to find American fighters strafing the airfields. They circled, low on fuel, watching their planned refuge burn below them. Most crashed into the sea. By 14:30, the battle was effectively over. Japanese aircraft losses exceeded 350. American aircraft losses totaled 23. The kill ratio approached 15-1. The Japanese pilots who survived struggled back to their carriers in scattered groups. Many became lost over the trackless ocean. Some ran out of fuel and ditched. Some found their carriers but crashed attempting to land, their limited training betraying them at the worst possible moment. The recovery operations were chaos. Aboard the surviving Japanese carriers, officers counted aircraft and pilots. The numbers were devastating. Carrier air groups that had launched with 60 or 70 aircraft now had 10 or 15. Some squadrons had been completely wiped out. The carefully trained pilots, the veterans who had survived 3 years of war, were gone. Admiral Ozawa finally understood the scale of the disaster. He had lost 2 carriers. He had lost nearly 400 aircraft. He had lost the cream of Japanese naval aviation, and he had accomplished nothing. Not a single American carrier had been damaged. The invasion of Saipan would continue. The war would continue. But Japanese naval aviation would not. That night, the surviving Japanese fleet withdrew westward. Ozawa had no choice. He had no aircraft left to fight with. His remaining carriers were empty shells, floating targets for American strikes that would surely come with dawn. The American pursuit came the next day, June 20th. Mitcher launched a late afternoon strike at extreme range, 300 miles, knowing his pilots would return after dark with fuel tanks nearly empty. The strike found the Japanese fleet and sank another carrier, the Hiyo. But the cost was high. 80 American aircraft ran out of fuel on the return flight. Pilots ditched in the dark ocean. Some were rescued, some were not. Mitcher made a decision that became legendary. He ordered the task force to turn on its lights. Every carrier, every cruiser, every destroyer blazed with illumination, creating a beacon visible for miles. It was a violation of every blackout procedure, an invitation to any lurking Japanese submarine. But it gave his pilots something to aim for. The recovery operations lasted through the night. Pilots landed on any carrier they could find. Some crashed on deck, some ditched alongside ships. Search and rescue operations continued for 2 days. Eventually, 160 of the 209 missing airmen were recovered. When the final tallies were complete, the scale of the Japanese defeat became clear. Nearly 400 Japanese aircraft destroyed. 3 carriers sunk, 2 damaged. Approximately 450 pilots and aircrew killed. American losses totaled 130 aircraft, most of them lost on the June 20th strike or in operational accidents. 76 American airmen died. The American pilots who flew that day knew what they had accomplished. The kill ratios were so lopsided, the destruction so complete, that the battle seemed less like combat than execution. Lieutenant Commander Paul Bi of the USS Hornets Air Group coined the phrase that would stick. It was like an old-time turkey shoot down home. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The name captured the awful reality. Japanese pilots had flown into a kill zone from which there was no escape. They had faced fighters they couldn't match, tactics they couldn't counter, numbers they couldn't overcome. Many had died without ever seeing the enemy who killed them. For Japan, the Battle of the Philippine Sea marked the end of carrier aviation as an effective fighting force. The trained pilots who died on June 19th could not be replaced. The aircraft lost could be rebuilt, but the men who flew them took years to train. Japan no longer had years. In the months that followed, Japanese naval aviation would continue to exist on paper. Carriers would sail. Aircraft would launch. But the men in the cockpits would be teenagers with minimal training, flying obsolete aircraft against enemies who could shoot them down almost at will. By October 1944, at the Battle of Leyte Gulf, Japanese commanders would resort to desperate measures. Kamikazes, suicide attacks. The admission that conventional aerial combat was no longer possible, that Japanese pilots could contribute more to the war effort by dying than by fighting. The seeds of that desperation were planted over the Philippine Sea on June 19, 1944. For American naval aviation, the battle confirmed what the Hellcat had promised: air superiority. Not just in individual engagements, but across the entire Pacific theater. From the Marianas forward, American carriers would operate with near impunity. Japanese air attacks would continue, but they would never again threaten the American fleet as they had at Pearl Harbor, at Midway, in the Solomons. Lieutenant Commander Charles Brewer survived the war. He finished with 15 confirmed kills, making him one of the Navy's top aces. After the war, He rarely spoke about June 19th. When asked, he would say only that it had been a long day. The memories were vivid, but not triumphant. He had killed men, many of them barely old, enough to shave. The fact that they would have killed him given the chance didn't make the memory easier. Lieutenant Alexander Vratiu also survived. His 6 kills on June 19th brought his total to 18, eventually rising to 19 before he was shot down over the Philippines and evaded capture. After the war, he became a test pilot, then retired to civilian life. He lived until 2015, one of the last surviving aces of the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Admiral Mark Mitcher received the Navy Cross for his leadership during the battle. He continued commanding fast carrier task forces through the end of the war, directing strikes against Japan itself. He died in 1947, worn out by years of combat leadership. Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa survived the war and was never tried for war crimes. He spent his remaining years in quiet obscurity, living with the knowledge that he had commanded the greatest defeat in Japanese naval aviation history. He died in 1966. The Hellcat continued its dominance through the rest of the Pacific War. By August 1945, F6F Hellcats had destroyed 5,223 Japanese aircraft in aerial combat. The overall kill ratio exceeded 19-1. No other fighter in any theater achieved comparable statistics. The Zero, once the terror of the Pacific, was relegated to kamikaze duty. The aircraft that had seemed invincible in 1941 was being shot down in droves by 1944. The myth had been shattered. The reality was burning wreckage scattered across 1,000 miles of ocean. The Battle of the Philippine Sea proved something that would shape military thinking for decades. Industrial capacity was not merely support for warfare, it was warfare. The nation that could build more aircraft, train more pilots, produce more carriers, would inevitably win. Courage and skill mattered, but they could not overcome mathematics. Japan had started the Pacific War with perhaps the finest naval aviators in the world. By June 1944, those aviators were dead, and Japan could not replace them. Meanwhile, American training programs were producing pilots in quantities that would have seemed impossible in 1941. The gap in quality that had favored Japan in 1942 had reversed by 1944, and the gap in quantity had become an abyss. The young Japanese pilots who climbed into their cockpits on the morning of June 19th believed they were flying to victory. Their commanders had told them so. Their training had prepared them for glory. They would strike the American fleet, sink American carriers, turn the tide of the war. Instead, they flew into annihilation. 400 aircraft vanished in a single day. 400 pilots and aircrew died believing they could win. And when the sky finally cleared over the Philippine Sea, America owned it completely. The past speaks through the wreckage still scattered across the ocean floor. Zeros and Hellcats, Judys and Jills, the remains of men who fought and died in a battle that decided the fate of empires. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot was not merely a victory. It was the moment when the Pacific War tilted irrevocably toward American triumph. From that day forward, Japanese naval aviation existed as a dying force, increasingly desperate, increasingly suicidal. The kamikazes that would terrorize American ships in 1945 were born from the ashes of June 19, 1944. When conventional tactics failed, when trained pilots vanished, only desperation remained. And in the cockpits of their Hellcats, American pilots had proven what industrial democracy could achieve. Not just victory, but dominance. Not just survival, but supremacy. The sky belonged to them, purchased with skill, bought with production lines, paid for with the courage to dive into enemy formations and trust that their aircraft would bring them home. 400 planes vanished in a single day. Japan would never recover, and the men who flew the Hellcats would carry that knowledge for the rest of their lives. They had not simply won a battle, they had ended an era. The Zero's reign was over. The Pacific was American, and history would remember June 19, 1944, as the day the sky itself changed hands.